Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we spoke, Inspector General, pointed out your office spent 19 months and interviewed 100 witnesses, and your report concluded that the FBI had an adequate predicate reason to open the investigation on the Trump campaign ties with Russia. Could you quickly define that predicate?
Yeah, so the predicate here was the information that the FBI got at the end of July from the friendly foreign government that reflected a meeting that the friendly foreign government had with Mr. Papadopoulos in May.
Who was the friendly government?
We don't mention that in the report, so I'm going to stick to what we have.
Is that classified?
That is, my understanding is still classified, but
Thank you.
As I sit here, I am only going to speak to what's in our report.
Okay, go ahead.
And as I mentioned in my statement, the comment was that Mr. Papadopoulos had made a suggestion that there had been a suggestion to the Trump campaign that the Russian government could provide information that would be damaging to candidate Clinton and then President Obama.
So your report states that you didn't find documentary or testimonial evidence that political bias or improper motivation played a role.
That's correct.
Thank you. And you didn't find a deep state conspiracy against candidate or President Trump.
So, as to the opening, we found no bias, no testimonial documentary evidence on that.
And no rationale for a deep state that...
We looked at Mr. Priestap, as I noted, was the decision maker, and we did not find any evidence in his emails or texts of having engaged in any bias or having any bias.
FBI Director Wray provided a written response to your report, accepting all of your findings. And these include the key finding that there was, quote, an authorized purpose and actual factual predication for the investigation. By contrast, Attorney General Barr expressed his doubt about the legitimacy of the FBI's investigation in press statements. Did Attorney General Barr provide any evidence that caused you to alter this key finding that the FBI investigation had an adequate predicate?
No, we stand by our finding.
Thank you. During your investigation, Attorney General Barr stated his belief that, quote, spying on the Trump campaign did occur, end quote. And as you said, your investigation found no evidence that the FBI placed any confidential source within the Trump campaign or tasked any confidential source to report on the Trump campaign. That's correct, right?
That's correct.
And further, no evidence that political bias or improper motivations influenced the decision to use confidential sources as part of the investigation.
That's correct.
Did your office ask Attorney General Barr and U.S. Attorney John Durham to share whatever evidence they had that might be relevant to your investigation?
We asked Mr. Durham to do that.
And what about Attorney General Barr?
And Attorney General Barr.
Thank you. So nothing they could provide altered your office's conclusion that the FBI did not place spies in the Trump campaign?
None of the discussions changed our findings here.
Thank you. In a press statement issued Monday, U.S. Attorney John Durham, tasked by Attorney General Barr to also investigate the origins of the Russia investigation, stated, and I quote, "Last month, we advised the IG that we do not agree with some of the report's conclusions as to predication and how the FBI case was opened." What's your reaction to that?
Well, I was surprised by the statement. I didn't necessarily know it was going to be released on Monday. We did meet with Mr. Durham, as I mentioned. We provided him with a copy of the report, as we did others, through our factual accuracy review process. We met with him in November. With regard to that, we did discuss the opening issue. He said he did not necessarily agree with our conclusion about the opening of a full counterintelligence investigation, which is what this was. But there is also an investigative means by which the FBI can move forward with an investigation. It's called a preliminary investigation. So there are two types of investigations, full and preliminary. They opened a full here. He said during the meeting that the information from the friendly foreign government was, in his view, sufficient to support the preliminary investigation. And as we note in the report, investigative steps such as confidential human source activity that occurred here are allowed under a preliminary investigation or under a full investigation.
Did either Barr or Durham present anything that altered your findings?
No.
I wanted to ask you, since we have the author of the whistleblower legislation very proudly sitting here, you previously told this committee that whistleblower rights and protections have been one of your highest priorities since becoming IG. As you know, there have been calls for the Ukraine whistleblower to be identified publicly, even though that person was not a direct witness to the events. So what is your view? Should the Ukraine whistleblower's confidentiality be breached and that person identified publicly? And why not?
So whistleblower protections have been one of my highest priorities. I've appreciated working with all the members of the committee, obviously particularly Senator Grassley. We wrote a letter recently as the IG community quoting his statement on the issues and the importance of whistleblowers. And whistleblowers have a right to expect complete, full confidentiality in all circumstances. It's in the law, in the IG Act that Congress wrote, and it's a very important provision.
Thank you. In a public hearing before the House Intelligence Committee, Deputy Secretary of State George Kent testified that politically associated investigations or prosecutions against opponents of those in power undermine the rule of law. Do you agree with that? Do politically motivated investigations undermine the rule of law?
I agree. Any politically motivated investigation undermines the rule of law.
Thank you very much. Did you find any evidence that President Obama or anyone else in the White House asked the United States government to investigate then-candidate Trump or his campaign?
We certainly didn't see any evidence of that in the FBI's files or the department's files, which was our mandate here in our authorized jurisdiction.
You have a policy recommendation regarding the use of confidential human sources. I'd like to ask a few questions about it. Your investigation found that the use of confidential human sources was consistent with existing rules, correct?
Correct.
The use of confidential human sources here was not solely to gather First Amendment protected information.
Correct, and that is the standard currently in the rules.
And you found no evidence that the decision to use confidential human sources was motivated by political bias.
Correct.
Is that correct? With regard to your policy recommendation, what, if anything, do you believe should be changed and why?
So as I mentioned in my opening statement, I think we were surprised to learn and concerned to learn that in an investigation of any political, national party political campaign, the confidential human source usage could be approved by only a first-level supervisor. In this instance, as we note here, some of them were approved at the assistant director level, but they could have been approved at just the line supervisor level. For an investigation of a major party presidential campaign of either side or of any side, that was concerning to us, particularly since there was not a requirement that any department lawyer, whether at the National Security Division, the Criminal Division, the Deputy Attorney General's Office, the Attorney General's Office, needed to be notified at any point in time.
Did you give interviews about your investigation while it was ongoing?
I'm sorry, did I?
Did you give interviews?
Oh, myself?
During the
No,
investigation?
I do not do that.
Did anybody on the IG team?
No, and it would have been entirely inappropriate for them to do so.
So just what, I'd just like to clear this up. What are the dangers of discussing an investigation that's ongoing?
So I actually wrote, and we wrote, a 500-page report about that we issued last year on the mid-year investigation, and among other things, criticized what occurred last year with regard to the handling of that investigation. Ongoing investigations, you don't know as an investigator, or you shouldn't conclude as an investigator until you are done with the investigation. You shouldn't be reaching your conclusions until that point. And so giving preliminary ideas, advice, guidance, statements can be misleading, and you should not be reaching final conclusions until you get to the end of the investigation.
There is a lot of misimpression about two people, Strzok and Page. So I want to ask this question. For the last 2 years, President Trump has relentlessly attacked former FBI officials as a way to undermine the investigation. For example, the president tweeted that, and I quote, "How can the wicked witch hunt proceed when it was started, influenced and worked on by Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, who exchanged text messages critical of candidate Trump? Your investigation found that while Lisa Page attended some of the discussions regarding the opening of the investigations, she did not play a role in the decision to open Crossfire Hurricane. You also found that while Strzok was directly involved in the decisions to open Crossfire Hurricane, he was not the sole or even the highest level decision maker to any of those matters. That decision, as I understand it, was made by FBI Assistant Director Priestap, as you have indicated, and by consensus after multiple days of discussions of meetings. Most importantly, you found that the decision had a proper factual basis and that there is no evidence that, quote, political bias or improper motivation influenced it. So, based on your investigation, personal political views expressed in text messages did not motivate the opening of the investigation of ties between Trump campaign advisors and Russia. Is that correct?
That's correct. Ultimately, we concluded that those text messages, which we found last year were entirely inappropriate, didn't ultimately play the role in Mr. Priestap's decision to open the investigation.
Thank you. So your investigation also uncovered text messages between other FBI employees expressing support for candidate and President Trump, correct?
That's correct.
So FBI employees held personal political views that were both favorable and unfavorable toward the candidate at that time.
That's correct. And as we note here, and we noted in last year's report, we did not find that text messages were inappropriate solely because people expressed a view as to which candidate they support or didn't support in an election. What concerned us with the text messages we outlined last year and reference again in this year's report as to certain individuals is the connection between their views and their work on the investigation.
To conclude my questioning, what do you believe, with your long experience, are the most important points that this 400-plus page report brings forward?
Well, I think there are several, as you might expect in a 400-plus page report.
That's why I still have time.
Yes. I think, as we outline in the executive summary, first, it was opened with the proper predicate, sufficient predication by a person, Mr. Priestap, who was not one of the text message persons and senior to those people. Third, that the confidential human source operations, while permitted by FBI policy, should cause everybody to give pause as to whether that policy is sufficient to provide accountability over decisions. And finally, that the FISA process here was not used appropriately, properly, and the rules were not followed.
Well, that concludes my questioning. I just want to say thank you, and thank you to your staff. I'm very grateful to the Inspector General's office, year in, year out. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would yield the balance of my time to Senator Leahy.
Yes, ma'am. We're going to have a vote at 12, and we will try to get through Senator Grassley and maybe Senator Leahy and take a break for lunch and come back about 30 minutes after that.
I think I'm going to take her remaining 5 minutes now.
Absolutely.
What you're saying about FISA is, as Senator Graham pointed out earlier, Senator Leahy and I have worked on trying to put in some protections in FISA, the USA Freedom Act, and so on. But
He gets 5.
the FBI accepted all of your findings, is that correct?
That's correct.
And that includes where you have raised questions about the use of FISA.
Correct.
Of the 5 investigations you reviewed, the only application for a FISA warrant was with respect to Carter Page, is that correct?
That's correct.
Out of the 5. The 17 errors affecting the Carter Page FISA application came after and thus did not impact the launch of the broader Russia investigation, which became the special counsel's investigation. Am I correct in that?
That's correct. Those occurred in October and later,
So it was not.
not in August when the matter was opened.
Now, so that came after
Or in
the
July.
special investigation came after. In the Mueller report, how many pages did the Mueller report refer to Carter Page?
I don't recall the exact number, but it wasn't a large number.
Well, I do know, 'cause I read it. It was 7 pages. That was out of 448 pages, so barely mentioned. I'm not trying to minimize FBI's mistakes here, but keep it in context. The FBI's errors in Carter Page's case do not undermine the unanimous assessment that Russia and not Ukraine interfered in our election. Is that correct?
Yeah, we describe in the report the information about Russia's, the conclusions about Russia's meddling in the 2016 election.
I remember one of the political events Mr. Trump was having. He said, Russia, if you're listening, take a look at this. Well, the Trump campaign seemed to welcome and exploit it. Now, none of these errors, and correct me if I'm wrong, minimize the legitimacy of the dozens of indictments and convictions that resulted from the special counsel's Russia investigation. Is that correct?
We make very clear here that the errors and serious problems we identify are concerning the Carter Page FISA and the people in that chain of command. We don't make any findings as to any other parts of Crossfire Hurricane, which was a far broader investigation.
The reason I mentioned that, I don't want to undermine, because of these errors, undermining the Mueller investigation. I believe they do not undermine the Mueller investigation. Am I correct?
Our review was not of the Mueller investigation. Our review was of the FISAs that were obtained, as we outline here, and of the opening of the investigation, and then the additional question we got about Mr. Orr's activities and the confidential human source use.
And you found, you did 19-month interview. Is it correct that you found no evidence that the investigation was motivated by anti-Trump or political bias? Is that correct?
We found no evidence that the initiation of the investigation was motivated by political bias. It gets murkier, the question gets more challenging, Senator, when you get to the FISA, and when you get to the attorney's actions, for example, in connection with that FISA.
Why I raised that. And did you conclude that there was a legitimate basis to investigate ties between Trump campaign advisors and Russia?
We concluded that the FBI had the predication to open it on July 31 and the subsequent subfiles that they opened about 10 days later or so.
And some of that came from, without naming the trusted foreign ally.
Correct. The information came from the friendly foreign government.
Yeah. And did you find that the FBI complied with and even exceeded current department rules on who can authorize an investigation, who has to be notified?
They followed all the rules with regard to that.
Does it refute the claims made by some that there's a deep state involved?
It finds that it was a properly predicated investigation based on the rules at the FBI.
And did you find anything where the FBI had planted spies in Mr. Trump's campaign?
We found no use of confidential human sources and placing them in the campaign or trying to put them in the campaign.
Okay, well, I've used up the 5 minutes that were left, and
You'll get your 10 minutes.
I was taking her
Yeah, thank
remaining
you.
5 minutes.